Monastics and modern conveniences. Geronda, how should monastics use modern conveniences? We should always be a bit behind in the quality of the things we use, compared to lay people. I feel much better when I use wood for heating, cooking and handiwork, and when we run out of forests, because of the way that people are exploiting them, I will use whatever is cheap and humble. An oil stove, for example, or some other type of heating, and a kerosene lamp to do my handiwork. How can one determine whether something is really essential in a Coenobitic monastery? If one thinks in a monastic way, it will be easy to figure it out. If a monastic does not think in a monastic way, then everything becomes a necessity, and the monastic becomes worse than those who live in the world. Monastics must live in humbler circumstances than they did when they lived in the world, never better. We should not have better things here than we did at our homes. In general, the monastery must be poorer than the homes in which we were raised. This helps the monastic with his or her interior life and will also be of help to lay people. By God's providence, people do not find peace in possessions and comforts. If laymen are troubled by all these modern comforts, you can imagine how much more these comforts can trouble the monastic. Suppose I found myself in a rich house, and the host asked where I would like to stay, in the living room with the fancy furniture, or in a stable with a couple of goats. I would honestly answer that I prefer the stable with the goats because I find more peace there. When I left the world to become a monk, I was not seeking a better house or some kind of mansion. My goal was to find something worse than what I had been used to. Otherwise, I am not doing anything for Christ. But today's logic works like this. Why would living in a mansion harm your soul? If you stay in the stable, it's going to stink, while a beautiful house will be full of sweet scents. It will be easier to make your prostrations. You must have a spiritual sensor. In a compass, for example, both arrows have magnets that turn the needle in one direction or the other. Christ has a magnet too, but we need one ourselves in order to turn towards him. In the old days, life in the Coenobitic monasteries was so hard. I remember the cauldron in the kitchen had a crank to lift it up. We used wood to light the fire and cook. The fire was either too low or too high, and the food would stick to the bottom of the cauldron. When a fish got stuck in it, they used a steel broom to scrape the bottom. Then we had to collect the ashes from the fire and place them in a clay jar with a hole underneath to make lye for washing the dishes. It was so rough on our hands, and we lifted the water with a windlass to the Athonite. Some of the things that I see today in monasteries are not justified. In one monastery, I saw the monks cutting bread with a machine. That's not fitting. If a monk is ill or not feeling well and cannot cut the bread with a knife, and there is a need to cut it, but there is no one else to do it, then using a machine is justified. But when you see a burly monk cutting bread with a slicing machine, you know there's something wrong. This fellow can work a jackhammer, but he uses a machine to cut bread and considers it an achievement. Make sure that you advance in spiritual matters and not in machines and comforts. Do not delight in these things. If monasticism loses the spirit of asceticism, the monastic life will have no meaning. If we make convenience the rule of monastic life, we will not prosper. The monastic avoids conveniences because they do not help him spiritually. Even in the world, excessive conveniences make life difficult, but conveniences do not befit a monk, even if he could find comfort in them. We should not seek what is comfortable. During the time of Saint Arsenios the Great, they did not have electricity or gas lights, only some fancy lamps in the palace that used very fine oil. Couldn't he have brought these lamps with him to the desert? Of course he could, but he did not. He used the cotton wick and seed oil or whatever was available at that time. We sometimes try to justify the use of machines and other conveniences by claiming that they help us to do our work faster and leave us more time for our spiritual work. But the opposite happens. Our lives become stressful and full of concerns and anxieties, like the lives of lay people. When a number of young monks joined a certain monastery, the first thing they did was to buy pressure cookers in order to have more time for their spiritual duties, prayer, study, and so on. But instead of doing that, they would just sit and talk for hours. You see, they did not use comforts to save time and use that time for their spiritual benefit. Today, comforts save us time, but there is no time for prayer. Geronda. I have heard people say that Saint Athanasius the Athonite was a progressive. Yes, he was progressive, but not in the sense that people understand the world today. Let them read the life of Saint Athanasius and see the difference. During his time, the monastery had 800 to 1,000 monks, and hundreds of poor and hungry people came looking for help. They gathered at the Lavra monastery, seeking food and shelter. The saint had even purchased 2 oxen for the mill in order to cope with all those mouths. Why don't we do the same thing today? He had to create a new type of oven and a novelty for his time, in order to bake enough bread to give to all these people. The Byzantine emperors had endowed monasteries with a lot of land because monasteries served as charitable institutions. These emperors funded and endowed monasteries in order to help lay people spiritually and materially. We must realize that all things will be lost, taken away, and we will find ourselves standing before God in debt. Actually, we monastics should not have even what today's laity throws away. Instead, we should have the worthless junk that the wealthy people of older times used to throw away. You must keep in mind 2 things. The first is that we are going to die, and the second is that we may not die from natural causes. You should be prepared to die of unnatural causes. If you remember these 2 things, all will be fine, spiritually and otherwise. Things will work out.